let's take some time to dive into Photoshop's layer styles. So layer styles are a special thing that can be added to any layer that's unlocked that is accessed by this FX button. So you can see there when I hover over it, it says add a layer style. And what layer you're clicked on does indeed matter because that's the layer that you would be adding the layer style to. I'm going to start off with text. So I've got this text that just says layer styles. And if we hit the FX button, you'll notice that we can see a list of the various layer styles that exist in Photoshop. Probably the most common is going to be stroke. Stroke is a border that goes around the layer. So notice that when I click on the FX button, it launches the layer style dialog box. You can change the color of that stroke. You can also change the size of the stroke. And this is actually kind of a small document. I'm zoomed in 180%, so it looks a little blurry. But you can see here at size 1 what this looks like. Notice that the stroke has a position. So mine is going outside the image or outside the edges of the text. You can say inside, which if you start to make it too big, it will overtake the entire text. And then don't worry here too much yet about blend mode or opacity with regards to this. And then here is your fill color for that. Now, of course, your size is going to matter. It's going to be a little different based on how thick your font is. So if I came here and I changed this font to something heavier, so let's say I do this Playbill font. It's kind of a fatter font. And if I make it bigger, then you can see that layer style doesn't seem as big. Now, if I double click here, you can notice that when you add the layer style, it adds it below the layer. And this little arrow here is how you can show or hide those. But if I double click where it says stroke here, it's going to bring this dialog box back up. And then, of course, I can continue to edit that stroke if I should so choose. Now, one of the cool things about the newer versions of Photoshop is you can actually add additional strokes. You'll see that I have more on here, but if you were to open it on your own computer, you wouldn't have multiple strokes on here. Matter of fact, some of these could even be missing and you would have to hit this button to get there. I'm going to reset this to the default list just so you would see it as it would if you didn't have anything at all. So now see, I have one stroke. So I can hit this plus sign here. And now I have a second stroke. So I can stroke around the first stroke. I'm going to make this yellow just so it's more noticeable. And then as I make it bigger, eventually it goes around the first one. Now the white one's a little hard to see. So let me click back on the white one and make it black. There you go. So now you can see. So there's the black stroke. And then behind the black stroke is a yellow stroke, which I made bigger than the black stroke. This is 3. So now you can see it around there. Okay, so additional ones that are pretty common, bevel and emboss. You don't generally use that on images, maybe on like a rectangle or something to make it look like a button, like on a web page. But a bevel kind of gives it that 3D look. So notice how when I add it to this one, it kind of gives it that, there's kind of all kinds of things going on here. I'm going to hit reset to default because I've messed with it. So this is what it would look like just out of the box. So you can see it kind of has that 3D feel, like you feel like you can touch it. That is just your standard inner bevel. You can change the size of the bevel if you don't want it to be as noticeable, or you can increase it to make it more, but you've got all those options. There's also all kinds of other little buttons, like you can change the angle of that bevel and emboss. I try not to get into these other settings too much, but if you do mess things up, just click reset to default and it'll take it back to the way it came out of the box. Okay, inner shadow and inner glow are basically the same thing, except shadows are going to be dark and glows are going to be light. So I'm going to hit OK here. Notice now we have multiple layer styles listed. So you see a bunch of layer styles listed underneath. So let's click on a different layer. I'm going to click on the tree, for example, and I'll hit the FX button one more time. And so we'll put an inner shadow on this tree. So notice now how there is a black kind of glow happening. That is an inner shadow. And if I turn it off, see there it is before, and turn it on, and you can see that shadow there. So by default, these shadows and glows are going to have opacities that are turned down. Opacity has to do with how see-through the shadow is. So it's at 35%. So you could turn it up, which makes it a lot darker, or turn it down, which is going to lighten it up some. You can also change the size if you don't like how far it's going in. That kind of also makes it sharper, I guess you would say. And then there's the distance to move it around and the choke. So you've got some different options here to modify that inner shadow. Glow does the same situation, same thing, except it's going to be light. I'm going to grab a hold of the twister here, and I will add an inner glow. So this glow is turned up a lot, so you can't even see it. Let me reset it to default. All right, so here we are at the default settings on this. So if I turn it up, you can see that glow. It's kind of subtle, but you can see that little glow in there, right? Again, you can adjust the choke, which is going to make it a little more prominent, but that's an inner glow. You can change the glow color. By default, it is going to be kind of a white color, but you can choose, not that I would want to have some of these other colors. It is set to a blend mode of screen, which means it's not going to show just straight up the color. You would have to make some changes. Like you can see it if I turn it up. It's like a little bit of that color. And that really has to do with some of the opacity. So I turn that up, we can actually see it more. Or you could change that blend mode. So like normal is not going to blend at all. It's just going to put that color straight up on there. Again, if you mess up any of this, just hit reset to default and it puts it back to normal. A lot of times I just go crazy messing with them and then I hit reset to default and go from there. And that's just a little bit easier to deal with. Okay. Some additional ones. I'm going to click on the heart and hit FX one more time. We've already done bevel, emboss, stroke, and inner shadow and glow. Satin is kind of a hard one to explain. I will be honest and say I don't use it a whole lot. It fills it with kind of this like see-through gray thing. It gives a little bit more depth. So you can see here, here's like before and then here's after. So it puts, I guess like if you had, you know, a satin dress or a satin skirt and how it kind of bunches up and you can see shadows in it, that's what that does. So yeah, I don't really ever use that one. Color overlay completely fills in the layer with color. So we're going to lose the face of this as soon as I choose color overlay. Okay. Now notice how if I just check the box, it's actually still on satin over here. So when you're using layer styles, don't just check the box, actually click on the words so that you have that. So notice now, if I wanted it to be a red heart, I could come over here and make the heart a different color. So that just fills it in completely. You lose all details, so you're basically just keeping the shape. Now, you can turn that down. So I could give it an opacity, and then you would start to see through it as it goes. You could also modify that blending mode. So normal is going to completely fill it in, but lighten, for example, is going to blend with it a little bit differently. Overlay is going to mix the two. Darken is going to put that red over the white and darken that area. So again, in its normal form, if we reset to default, it's going to be set to normal, and then you would just give it a color to change the current color. Now you don't need to use this on shapes because on shapes you can just change their colors. But if you had an image that has no background and you just want to fill it in with color, that's what color overlay would be for. And basically the same as that is gradient overlay. Gradient overlay just puts a gradient over the top of it. Let me reset to default so you can see here it's going on these grays. I could choose a rainbow and we would have a gradient laid over the top of it. Next one is a pattern overlay, which shows a pattern. Cool thing about patterns is it comes with some patterns and you can scale them. So like if it's too big, you can pull the scale down and then it repeats it more, or you can scale it up and then it'll get blurry, of course, the more that you go up with it. And you can load additional patterns. If you click the drop down in the gear, there's a whole bunch of patterns in here. So say texture fills, you hit OK. And I won't save the current one. And then you've got all your different textures that you can use. Once again, the blending mode by default is going to be normal, which means take over. If you want it to blend with what's underneath, you could choose one of these, and then you can see how it blends. So when you choose overlay blending mode, it kind of leaves black and white alone. So you can see then only where there was color did it blend that pattern in there. So that's kind of an interesting look. Okay, and then we have outer glow and drop shadow. I'm going to go ahead and add a drop shadow to this heart. I'm going to reset it. So drop shadows have a blend mode of multiply, which makes them a little bit see-through. Notice it's set to black. You can make your shadow bigger or smaller like so. You can also adjust that spread, which kind of makes it not as fuzzy. There we go. Fun fact, you can take your mouse and come over here and pick up and move the shadow around. So if you don't like the way that it's positioned, you can scoot it over, just like that, manually. Okay, so that is drop shadow. Again, I'm going to reset it to default and just make the... They're kind of subtle, like in their actual form, it's basically a very subtle thing. If you wanted to get rid of any of these, just hit the trash can when you're clicked on the layer or uncheck from in here and it will get rid of it. I'm going to hit OK. And there we go. We can see my heart has the pattern overlay and the drop shadow on there. So let's go to the twister. And actually here, we'll go to the puppy dog because I haven't done anything to him yet. Let's go to the puppy dog. Let's go to Toto. We're going to add drop shadow. So drop shadows, as we looked at here, aren't really, I mean, they're not like real shadows. If this dog was standing here going down the brick road, right, his shadow would be cast in front of him if the sun is back there. It wouldn't just border around his body. That's something people struggle with a lot in Photoshop. They want to put a shadow on something to match other shadows in a picture, but there is no shadow because this shadow just does this. So if you want to disconnect a shadow, you can do that, but before you do that, you need to make sure the shadow is the size and the clarity that you want it to be. So if I wanted it to be, you know, a little stronger, I could go here. If I wanted it to still be fuzzy, I could go there. Just depends on what kind of light you're trying to simulate. And then, like I said, you can pick it up and move it. So get it so you like it, and then know that you're going to move the position of this in a second. Okay, so let's say that that works for me. If it's too dark, you can lighten it. Just pull the opacity back some more. Okay, so I'm going to hit OK. And now I'm going to take this drop shadow and I'm going to move it to its own layer so that I can manipulate that shadow on its own. So I'm going to right click it and you're going to go to create layer. And what that's going to do, and sometimes it'll give you like a, not an error, but a warning. Some things you can't do with layers. I'm going to hit OK because this is not one of them. Now it says Toto, and now we also have Toto's drop shadow. Now notice it's also set to multiply blend mode because that's what it was when it was in the dialog box. And the fill is at 21% because that's kind of the opacity level that was going on there. So here it is, Toto's drop shadow. Now I can press Control-T and transform, and then I can take the top and pull it upside down like so. And then I can try to match it up to make it look more like a real shadow. Now, the fun thing about Photoshop is there's a lot of transforms in here. So I can right click and choose a different transform like perspective or skew or distort. I'll use skew. Let me zoom out just a little, Control- here. And then I can grab a hold of this and see I can like pull it so that I can say the sun's coming from, you know, say this direction. And now it moves like so. Okay. Then of course you might want to pick it up and kind of match it up with where the feet are. I'm going to hit OK here. Now you can put these two back together, but if you do, it won't be editable anymore. So you can put them together. If I hold Shift and click both, that selects both. And you can merge those two layers. However, I'm not going to merge these two. I'm just going to link my layers, which is what I like to do. And link just basically means that if you move one of them, move the other one with it. So now they're linked together. So now if I move him over here onto this road, they are linked together and I don't have to worry about like accidentally not remembering to bring the shadow, for example. So that's a basic rundown of layer styles. And again, there's a ton of layer styles. Just remember you can add multiple layer styles. You can modify layer styles. You can put them out on their own layers. And you can make those blending mode changes. But if something looks weird, you can always reset to the default. Now, one little bit of bonus information. There is a panel called the Styles panel. And the Styles panel are pre-made styles, which is simply these things. It's just pre-made sets of layer styles, okay? So I'm going to click on the house. This is going to look pretty dumb, but that's okay. I'll click on the house because I don't have anything on that. But on these layer styles, if you click on the three lines, you can load up various style sets. So say photographic effects. If I say okay, these are things that you might put on a photograph. So notice this just gave my house a texture. Or this changed the color to like a sepia tone. If you put your mouse over them, they tell you what they do. Screened luminosity, blue duotone. So you can kind of see these would be things that you might put just on a picture. However, if you look down here, you can see what it did. It just added a color overlay. Now let's click on here. I'm going to go to, let's do text effects because those are a little more exciting and will look really weird here on a house. But that's okay. So now if I click on these, notice these styles completely overtaken. If you look, there's like a lot of things going on. So these are kind of good ways for you to like try to understand what all these layer styles do. Like for instance, what's going on here? Well, let's just double click down here to bring this up and we can see what's happening. So it's got a bevel and an emboss with a contour, right? And then there's a satin on here, and the satin is sent to an overlay mode with an opacity of 50. So if I start to pull this back or up, you can kind of see the way that's working. You could change these blending modes just to see what's happening. You can modify these numbers to see what that does. So just a lot of like starting points can be achieved if you start with these styles. But to be honest, I use the styles more with text. You know, if you've got some words on there and you want to do something kind of fancy to it, you can add that through here. So that is an example of using layer styles in Photoshop.